días. Tenemos hoy con nosotros al profesor Larry Dwyer, que no necesita mucha presentación, pues digamos, podría, yo creo que considerarse sin ninguna exageración como el mayor experto a nivel mundial en economía del turismo. Y hoy yo no sabía que él había trabajado también en este tema hasta hace poco, porque realmente ha sido un tema relativamente reciente, el tema del turismo marino y un poco turismo costero y marino. Y este tema es una gran oportunidad para Canarias. Today we have here, I didn't introduce you, Antonio, ¿cómo el apellido? Herrera. Antonio Herrera. He comes from chemical studies, and they are studying
how to connect the chemistry with the tourism.
Chemistry and tourism, true. Iodine?
It's trying to connect the iodine chemistry with the chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, and then tourism.
Okay.
So it seems to be very in the opposite side.
Yes, they are. The beaches in the Canary Island have a lot of natural iodine. Iodine. Iodine, the chemical.
That's the salt.
You know the salt?
Iron?
Iodine.
Iron? No, iodine.
Iodine. This is a chemical element. Iodine.
You should give yourself.
What the salt has? The salt.
Chlorine? I don't know.
Chlorine and iodine.
Chloride and iron.
Iodine, bromine. Iodine is one of the allergens.
Right, okay.
Well, it has a very good effects on the health of people with respiratory problems and that kind of. And they are beginning to build a network. Most people here does not knew his project, but they are working in this, and they need tourism researchers also to be involved with the chemical approach to the question. We have here Sarah also from the Destination Management Organization of the island, that they are working also in tourism and environment. We have Angel that is related with the sport tourism in the sea, particularly with surfing. We have also one person that couldn't come here, but this is related with protected marine areas, fisheries, and all this kind of, and tourism, no? And the relation with protected marine areas, tourism, and here is one of his research students. So we have this field of knowledge provokes a lot of different interests, and we must here in the university try to build that network and to be in the research community on an international level, be giving reply to the problems related with the ocean, with the marine tourism, and so on. So I shut up and now your turn.
Thank you very much. Well, I was invited to lead a team to look at the issues of exploring the prospects for emerging ocean industries. So, an OECD project, and there's many ocean industries, you know, oil and gas and biotechnology and wind turbines and wave motions and so on, creating energy. and one of the industry sectors that was considered was tourism. And I was invited to lead a team of researchers that we've now put in a report to the OECD, and I believe it will be published on the web very soon, if not already. So I thought what I'd do today is give an overview of the issues, and clearly it's a big area, and you know, a lot of your particular interests may not be covered, but I'm going to try to give you a view of what the report's about. I'm quite happy if anyone wants this PowerPoint, they can get it. So I'm happy to make it available to you. The contents of the report were basically some background as to why tourism is important in the coastal marine environment, some valuation issues, some growth projections, challenges to sustainable growth of coastal marine tourism, and identifying some opportunities in the future. That was the structure of the report. Now, the coastal marine tourism is the economic backbone of many coastal marine regions, offers potential for growth, employment in related industry sectors, raising local incomes, strengthening and enhancing local marine infrastructure, improving living standards, local communities. And you would relate to that living in the Canary Islands. However, coastal marine areas contain some of the world's most pristine environments, which make them very fragile. And tourism has social environmental effects, which can transform these fragile environments. The key challenge is how to develop tourism in a coastal marine context while not adding significantly, or not adding at all, to the pressures on the social and environmental environments. Now, what did we hope to gain from this report for the OECD? Well, one was a definition of coastal marine tourism. What is it? Another expected outcome was giving some idea of the value of coastal marine tourism as a sector within tourism generally, and what was the potential economic contribution of future developments in this area. What are the drivers of growth of coastal marine tourism? What are the new and emerging tourism industries in the future of coastal marine tourism? What are the challenges, the risks and constraints to sustainable development of these new industries and new destinations? We looked at some challenges to island and archipelago communities, and as I say, Canary Islands people would be able to relate to some of those challenges that we looked at. And opportunities, integrated long-term planning and governance processes. One of the big issues in this whole area is we've detected a lack of good governance of the coastal marine tourism. And by and large, that's because there's a lot of common pooled resources and so on. And so governance issues are very important. So these were some of the expected outcomes of the report. Let's have a look at some of these. The definition of coastal marine tourism. We need a clear definition, because if someone says, well, what's the value of coastal marine tourism, we need to know what it is. And it's not always obvious. We need to delimit its scope for economic evaluation. We need to delimit its scope for governance as a jurisdiction, and we need to limit its scope for formulating policy that covers coastal marine tourism. The problem, as you well know, is tourism is not an industry like other industries. It's a collection of different industries which sell products to tourists, as well as a range of different economic agents. Now, the coastal part of coastal tourism embraces the full range of tourism, leisure, recreation that take place in coastal zones and offshore coastal waters. But then your marine tourism relates more to the sea and ocean-based areas. And the difference between the two concepts, we were unable to give a hard, fast distinction. It's just a matter of degree. Coastal is nearer the coast, marine is further away from the coast. But of course, the concepts can be blurred. It's one of degree. And an alternative to geographically based definitions, we define that, you know, coastal is this geography and marine is more remote geography, is to adopt a cross-functional definition and call it coastal marine tourism as a concept, removing the barrier between coastal and marine. So it's the one concept, as it were. And in doing that, you focus attention on managing both the coast and the marine tourism because they're all so related to one another. So the report talks about some of those issues. Valuation, enormously difficult to value what World Marine Leisure and Tourism comes to. There are some figures available in reports. This figure here basically regards the coastal marine tourism as 10.5% of all international tourism, like worldwide. So the people who made this report have estimated that overall coastal marine tourism is about 10.5% of all tourism. You know, like a lot of tourism worldwide is in cities and so on, which is not coastal marine tourism, right? But this report estimates overall it's 10.5%. And what they've done then is basically regarded the amount of money spent in respect to coastal marine tourism as 10.5% of all tourism expenditure worldwide. Now, if we wanted to value the different subsectors here, where do you stop? You know, you stay at the direct effects, do you look at the indirect impacts, along value chains and so on. Many of the estimates neglect domestic tourism, which is ridiculous because in Europe, of course, you would know that in the summer seasons, the people in France and in Spain and so on flock to the coastal marine destinations and so on. I don't think the estimates are realistic at a global level because it's just such a difficult area to estimate. But I think this is as good a way as any to go, basically saying, well, if we can come to some figure of it's about 10.5% of all international tourism worldwide, then a value of direct expenditure would be applied to that, you know, same percentage, 10.5%. Value of cruise tourism is a bit more easier to measure, and there's been economic modelling of the economic impact of cruise tourism with millions of onshore visits by cruise lines, passengers, crew and so on. In total, these expenditure, cruise-related expenditure, generates global output of about $117 billion. Employs just under 1 million people working in cruise lines and associated and so on. I think that's probably an underestimate because it would mainly focus on the major cruise lines and so on. But you know, it's certainly a very important sector. Now, if we put this in a context of the world tourism forecasts, if you look at this graph, which comes from the United Nations World Tourism Organization, you see that out to 2030, a very substantial increase in tourism is forecast, an annual average increase of around 43 million international tourists. Now, people in the tourism industry love this figure. Oh, that's great. Tourism is healthy. I worry about this figure because of the social and environmental effects that undoubtedly will be generated by these extra visits. Now, tourism is going to continue to grow worldwide. The big driver of tourism internationally, of course, is economic growth. As the world's economies grow, more and more outbound tourism occurs. A dynamic world economy creates the basis for continued growth in both domestic and international tourism as people seek these new experiences. And as you know, tourism's discretionary expenditure, so as people's incomes grow, they will then spend more on tourism. But at the same time, world population's growing. So there's more and more people becoming more and more wealthier, wanting to travel. And more people, bigger world economy, means more tourists. Well, what does this mean for coastal marine tourism? The trends support a continuing growth in tourism worldwide. This is global tourism, not just coastal marine tourism. On the demand side, you have people living longer, increased urbanisation, people want to get out of cities and travel, high standard of healthcare, we live longer, changing work patterns, we're more flexible, taking time off and travelling, we're better educated, there's more migration, we engage in holidays to manage our stress, and this changes in people's values and so on towards hedonistic pursuits and leisure recreation pursuits and so on, and seeking these authentic experiences that come about through travel. And there's supply side developments, information, communication technology, transportation, growth of travel companies and intermediaries, continuing influence of destination management organisations who are promoting tourism destinations and so on. It's a serious, there's liberalisation of air transport, deregulation and so on. Tourism is a serious development strategy for less developed countries. World Bank, International Monetary Fund and so on are contributing money into infrastructure and so on, which can support tourism development in different countries, and of course globalisation of social networks. All of these come together to support this increase in tourism growth. Well, specifically with respect to coastal marine tourism, we have these additional sorts of considerations which tell us that coastal marine tourism is going to be increasing as well. The demand for a range of different activities, we can add whale watching there. Tourism to small island developing states is rising faster than average tourism growth rates worldwide. People have greater environmental and ecological consequences now. They are looking for unspoiled locations, such as La Palma that we talked about. Well, how long do these locations remain unspoiled? Demand for higher quality facilities, gastronomy, catering, increased interest in coastal environments and associated cultural attractions. You know, coastal towns, villages, historic sites, ports. Whenever I go to a new destination, I love to go down to the port area. There's always good cafes and bars and historic areas around the port and so on. Enhanced interest in nature, wildlife watching, greater interest in self-improvement. People are wanting newer, richer, deeper, authentic experiences. Greater interest in combining coastal opportunities with other experiences and so on. And there's all-inclusive offers and facilities. Growth of tourism is one of the most expanding markets worldwide is cruise tourism. And there's a growth in coastal second homes. A lot of people buy homes on the coast and go there for their holidays. So there are trends which support the trends I was talking about that would lead us to believe that coastal marine tourism is going to continue to grow. Now, what are some of the types of coastal marine tourism? Well, this is one way of classifying them. We have heritage tourism, which is, you know, lighthouses and museums, military heritage sites, natural heritage along the coast, maritime towns and cities and so on. A lot of heritage, because many nations were seafaring nations and so on. So a lot of heritage tourism is related to coastal marine tourism. Then you have thematic itineraries, diversification, integration of coastal inland attractions, cultural, religious, ancient trade routes, health and spa. We talked today about La Palma having spa facilities that are now being developed. Alleged medicinal, therapeutic qualities of sands and clays and thermal waters. I guess that's the sort of thing you're looking at. Yeah. Complementary activities here, expanding wine tasting, gastronomy, conferencing, special events, and so on. Enriching the product that surrounds coastal marine destinations. Then we have underwater hotels, seafloor, floating resorts and so on that are being developed in many parts of the world. Deep sea tourist expeditions. Tourists now want to go in these submersibles, submarines, and explore depths, quite a way under the water, in deep ocean ecosystems. Marine ecotourism, marine parks, underwater archaeological parks, coral reefs and other locations with archaeological, ecological, historical value. Recreational boating is very important, and yacht tourism is also very important. Now, some of these are old established markets, but others are new markets and so on. And part of what we were expected to do with this report was to try and flag some of the directions in which coastal marine tourism will head. Recent cruise industry innovations in response to customer needs. This is a new generation of mega cruise ships is developing, relying on economies of scale. The bigger the ship, the lower the cost of transport per passenger. New design, technological innovation and so on. They're floating hotels, they're floating resorts, offering multifaceted recreational shipboard experiences. And a huge amount of money is being invested in this sector by the cruise ship industry.
These are English billion, no?
Sorry?
These are English billion, no? When you talk about billion, you talk about thousands of millions.
Oh, thousands of millions.
Yes.
It's the US.
Sure, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's the US, thousands of millions, yeah. And there's new marine destinations, especially the polar regions. Cruises to the Antarctic are relatively few, and these are subject to big restrictions. But there's a lot of expansion of cruising into the North Pole area. But there's all sorts of issues here: biosecurity issues, risks and so on from oil spills, degradation of sites, pollution and so on. There is an attempt to restrict some of the operations of the cruise lines. They must comply with certain regulations that are developed by the International Maritime Organization. Unfortunately, the problem with cruise ships is that rogue captains and so on can always spill oil or garbage when they're in international waters and they're not being seen. So it does require cooperation. And also from other non-tourism industries such as oil and gas. because cruising is now in areas where there's oil and gas as well. In our report, we emphasise the importance of the precautionary principle, which is basically don't do something if it's going to have irreversible effects, and be very, very cautious in undertaking activities which can have these nasty consequences. Our view is that the Antarctic regulations are the ones that should be followed. They're very strict. There's not much tourism into the Antarctic, but what is there conforms to some very stringent regulations, and we believe that that is a framework for the polar regions in general. We believe that tourism development can learn risk assessment from other emerging ocean industries attempting to cope with extreme environmental conditions. So oil and gas, for example, have to cope with all sorts of issues of spillages and so on, and working in remote environments and being environmentally friendly and so on. We believe that there needs to be cooperation between tourism and other industry sectors because there's common problems involved. Emerging marine tourism industries have the potential to create habitat loss, biodiversity loss, effect on ecosystems, and so on. There's a need for increased scientific research, which isn't happening to the extent that it should. There's development of the polar regions and so on with cruising, but the scientific research is lagging well behind the increase in tourism. We need visitor-operated codes of conduct and so on. We need them to be enforced. We need protocols to be developed with other industries, cargo shipping, oil and gas. So when you're dealing with new destinations, then there needs to be cooperation, because it's not just the tourism industry that's going out into these new destinations such as the polar regions and so on. It is also other industries as well that are going into these areas for their own purposes. Now, I've been concerned for some time now about the business as usual approach in tourism. We tend, in English we say, we give lip service to something. Now, lip service is basically, oh yes, you acknowledge something is important, but you keep on doing what you're doing. So, we all agree for the need for sustainable development, right? There's no one here that would disagree, that we don't. No one is against sustainable development. We're all, motherhood, you know, we're all for motherhood and so on. We're all for sustainable development. But in most cases, sustainability practices are not put into operation. And it seems to me that the adverse environmental and social impacts are going to worsen. If you go back to the graph I put, more and more tourists, to me, mean more and more possibilities for adverse environmental and social impacts. We need to question the assumptions that drive coastal marine tourism. Are present growth rates sustainable? Are we at a tipping point where you know, the tourism can bring about enormous social and environmental bad effects? Do we really want growth? Growth seems to be the mantra. Grow, grow, grow. That's what the tourism industry want. But is that really what the planet needs? Critics state it's better to aim for development, which includes quality of life issues and environmental issues, rather than growth per se. Major attitudes underpinning the business as usual approach include a narrow view of business objectives. Milton Friedman's view that the purpose of the firm is to make profits for owners and shareholders. Well, there's another view, and the view is that the mission statements of firms should include objectives above and beyond just making profits. There should be a social ethic involved in the mission statements of firms, and I've been doing some work in that area. A growth-oriented viewpoint. The view is that growth per se is a good thing, but you know, growth is bringing about all sorts of adverse consequences. There's a view driven by an anthropocentric ethic, that is the Judeo-Christian view, that, you know, God created the heavens and the earth and the fish and the sea and the elephants and the whales and so on for the enjoyment of mankind. Now that ethic, that has led to exploitative growth. That's why there's no bisons left in North America, because they've been killed off by the colonists and so on. That's why human beings, you know, destroy and exploit land and so on, because they think, well, that, you know, it's all there for human beings to exploit. Well, I've been arguing, well, I'm writing some stuff at the moment, that is proposing an environmental ethic. That is an ethic that is a wider ethic than just the value of land for human use. Anyway, there's a whole philosophical literature attached to that. And a product-centric ethic, rather than a customer-centric ethic, is product fixation attached to tourism and so on. But basically, in the report, we stop to question the assumptions that underpin tourism development. You see, just to elaborate, this narrow view of business objectives, we talk about the importance of corporate social responsibility or triple bottom line reporting. And firms all say, oh yes, we care about corporate social responsibility and so on. But by and large, it costs firms to do that. And the costing of it conflicts with the making of profits. And so you need a wider sense of mission so that things like corporate social responsibility become more part of the business model. And I think that's important. Challenges to sustainable growth and coastal marine tourism. The report nominated or highlighted quite a number of constraints or challenges that we face in sustainable growth. And there's a lot of them. I'm going to just mention them very briefly. As I say, you're welcome to have this. Some will be more difficult to confront than others, and while many of them are already relevant to the growth of tourism, many of them will be much more important in the context of new and developing forms of coastal marine tourism. Let's have a look at just some of them. The rapid, uncontrolled urbanisation. Coastal tourism is developed in a haphazard, unplanned fashion. You go to any of the... I drove through Malaga a few years ago. I was appalled at the development of Malaga and so on, the high rise, the English pubs, the awfulness and so on. You go to Mallorca, whether it's the English areas or the German areas and so on, the high rises. You know, you've got this urbanisation, second homes, you've got buildings, casting shadows on the beaches, coastal erosion and so on. Often it's developers with political connection that gain control of the land and develop it the way they want. Second homes are proliferating. Urban development has negative effects. Coastal degradation of beaches, soil erosion, untreated sewage entering the seas, destruction of habitat and so on. And these losses are often irreversible. So urbanisation is affecting the coastal parts of coastal marine tourism. Poor governance. We have fragmented approaches to policy making. As I mentioned, marine ocean resources are frequently common property resources. Who owns the whales in the sea? Who owns the ecosystems that occupy the oceans and so on? And the nature of the tourism industry itself makes coordinated development complex, because you have different sectors within tourism, and often they don't talk to each other very well at all, and formulate common policies. Cooperation is often confined to stakeholders along the lines of traditional activities. You know, the hoteliers might talk to the hoteliers, the tourism operators might talk to each other and so on, but despite the best efforts often of destination management organisations, there is still sort of a lot of competitiveness within tourism, and holistic decision making is affected because of the lack of good governance. Many locations are overly dependent on tourism. Coastal marine tourism destinations typically susceptible to two types of dependence, I think. One is the dependence on tourism in general as an export market. Many coastal marine tourism destinations worldwide are very much dependent on tourism in general. So if there's a global financial crisis, for example, tourism dries up, those destinations can be very severely affected indeed. And of course, because many of these destinations are susceptible to price-sensitive mass markets, where the intermediaries are very powerful, the tour wholesalers and so on are very powerful, then many of them don't get the rewards because not enough of the tourist money comes to them. Much of it stays offshore. But then there's a dependence within the tourism market. Some destinations are overly dependent on one or two markets. Like Mallorca is very dependent, as I understand, on the German and English markets. So if either of them dry up for some reason, then you know that can lead to some sorts of problems. There's an over-reliance on tourism from particular origin markets, such as England or such as Germany or Russia or whatever. But then there's also an over-reliance on a particular tourism product. Beach recreation, yachting, surfing. Some destinations just are overly dependent on particular niche markets. And if those markets dry up for any reason, they can be in trouble. And of course, we all know about the seasonal nature of tourism arrivals. That can be seasonal imbalances and so on can affect the economies of many of these tourism destinations. I don't think there's been enough study done of destination dependency, and I think it's a very important area, especially with coastal marine tourism, and especially with small island developing states. And of course, it's a very important issue for such Canary Islands, for example. Then there's the impacts of other industries on tourism. Development of different emerging ocean industries, such as offshore wind turbines, oil and gas, can impact on tourism use. Because tourism is competing with these other industries for scarce resources, for the water, for the areas and so on. And so activities related to aquaculture, minerals exploration, extraction, spills from oil tankers, garbage can affect the quality of the marine environment, because you have these different industries all wanting to use the same bodies of water. Coral reefs are particularly vulnerable to sea mining activity and so on. Now, governance processes need to monitor the inter-industry effects and associated expansion of each of the emerging ocean industries. And our study shows that the governance processes are not very good. And so, at the moment, we have these different industries expanding, the oil and gas and the minerals exploration and so on, tourism, and there's not sufficient exchange of information or governance processes that relate to the situation. Now, of course, tourism affects other industries, and I'm going to talk about this on Wednesday. This tourism industry is composed of many industries. Poorly planned development can have a detrimental effect on other industries and on the social fabric of local communities, but also an expanding tourism industry draws resources away from other industries. And this is known as the Dutch disease effect. You probably thought it was something to do with being too long around Amsterdam railway station and the area there. But it's nothing to do with that. It's that the tourism industry, as it grows, takes resources from other industries, and so industry balance is affected. And economists say there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. If tourism expands, it will be, to some extent, at the expense of other industry sectors. And that's something that the tourism industry generally doesn't admit or doesn't know. And when the people lobby for more and more tourism growth, effectively they're saying that they realise that the tourism growth will impact adversely on other sectors. It can lead to deindustrialisation. And economists call this a miserisation of the local economy. And I do think we have to take account of this, that as tourism grows, other industries will be affected. And that's why you need good governance at the highest levels to be able to assess the relative claims of different industries to expand, because they will affect each industry as it expands affects the expansion of other industries. Education, training and skills. Investing in people is a condition for sustainable competitive growth of coastal marine tourism. And our study found that coastal marine tourism often has difficulty attracting skilled personnel working in the various sectors. There will be an increased demand for people with language skills and language training. Working in different cultural environments is going to be important. In fact, the European Commission has recently invited the maritime industry to participate in training skills programs, quality control initiatives for tourism products and staff, and create and promote open online courses to upgrade or improve skills in coastal marine tourism field. So the European Commission is serious about education in this sector. Transport. Well, I don't have to tell you people who live in Canary Islands about the importance of good transport networks. Often, however, we have poorly conceived transport networks. Many coastal areas, severe road congestion, energy consumption, parking problems and so on. And we have sometimes very poor alternative public sector transport links. Often the transport along coastal areas is very poor, forcing people to travel by car, the roads are congested, and so on. Remote island destinations often have very poor access because they don't have the numbers that warrant good transport links to be maintained, unless they're subsidised by government, which means subsidised by taxpayers. But aviation is critical to the expansion of many coastal marine destinations, small island developing states. The aviation environment, as we know, is constantly changing, and this is a real challenge for many, especially small island destinations to grow. They need the expansion of aviation, and often they can't be magically provided. Climate change. Tourism is one of the sectors most likely affected by climate change. Climate change can generate some positive effects on some destinations. I hear that the beaches in England are going to be more pleasant as the world gets warmer, but who'd want to swim on one of those English beaches anyway, you know? There will be winners and losers at the business, destination and nation level, But there will be lots of losses in respect of small island countries. Rising sea levels will cause coastal erosion, loss of beach area, higher costs to protect waterfronts and so on. Recent studies in Australia's Great Barrier Reef show that the coral is bleaching very fast, becoming very white, and it's the biggest living thing on the planet, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and it's going to lose its beautiful colours in the not too distant future because of the warming of the waters and so on. So, small island tourism destinations, particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. More dives may well disappear under the water. At some of these discussions of climate change, the Kyoto Protocol and Copenhagen and so on, the representatives of the Maldives wore scuba diving equipment to the meetings to make the point that unless something's done about mitigating climate change, their country will disappear under the water. And there needs to be a lot of research done on the capacity of different destinations to adapt to climate change. There seems to be a low level of innovation in many of these coastal marine areas. The problem is that tourism consists of a lot of small and medium enterprises, and they're notorious for having low profitability and, of course, then low innovative culture and innovative capacity. They have limited capacities to effectively address certain challenges: the transport, infrastructure constraints, restricted market access, inadequate capacities, product level development limitations. And that's the reason why in tourism we're finding more and more larger firms. There's a consolidation in the tourism industry, a merging of firms, the growing. Bigger firms are getting bigger, smaller firms are getting smaller. And this lack of innovative culture and so on can affect the types of products and services that are on offer in coastal marine tourism. Lack of information and data. When it comes to knowing what the effects of tourism development are on the coastal marine tourism, there's all sorts of challenges. There's different valuation measures, irregularities in data coverage, national statistics are often complete. I was talking with Raoul over coffee this morning, and we agreed that a lot of tourism focuses on national level statistics, but not at local level. And so at the local level, where lots of effects are taking place, we are often ignorant of what those effects are. Many parts of the ocean are virtually unknown.
Larry, I think this is the most astonishing thing, no? About working in coastal and marine area, that there's no data at all, there's no registered business, there's nothing. I mean, this has been going on. We are not discovering tourism in the coast now, but suddenly there was a subterranean, underground economy around the coast that it was not seen in any statistics, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. No, it's astonishing that there's such a lack of local knowledge, And this restricts the networking opportunities for firms in coastal marine tourism. Lack of knowledge of key data affects investment, increase the risks of project failure because they were not sufficiently aware of the various effects that the investments might have. Economic assessment of coastal marine tourism, how can that take place unless you have a clear idea of the impacts, let alone put dollar values or euro values on the impacts? You can't put the euro values on the impacts unless you know the impacts, and unless you have the scientific data, you don't know what the impacts are. So, and the required type of information is not confined just to scientific data about the effects on ecosystems and habitat and growth rates of species and so on. but it's also the social impacts, the effects on the social fabric and so on of coastal environments. There's ineffective monitoring. This is similar to the lack of information, but we need to track the health and performance of the ocean, assets of the ocean and so on. Monitoring key indicators. Regular reporting is fundamental to prudent management. Good management requires monitoring, but often we don't know the criteria and procedures used in inspections. We don't understand the social aspects. We don't, monitoring might be infrequent, processes fragmented, and often the activities of firms is often just ignored. Financial constraints. Access to finance and support for R&D and innovation, important. Obviously firms need access to finance. Banks often lack the knowledge to adequately assess tourism-related projects, and often, especially coastal marine projects. Investments are needed to revitalise waterfronts, seasonal festivals, development of water-based activities and so on. The development of new types of tourism infrastructure. These can face bigger risks and greater difficulties of getting financial backing. And of course, the dispersed economic actors make it more difficult for each of them to secure finance. Now, when I wrote this section of the report, I thought, well, there's the same assumption here that drives a lot of the thinking in tourism generally and in coastal marine tourism. And that is, we need finance in order to invest more so the sector can grow. But the problem is, do we want that? I mean, what about the business as usual approach that I flagged? I found in coastal marine tourism there's a lot of discussion about the finance issue. How can processes, procedures be developed that firms can gain finance to develop coastal marine activities? Which in one respect that's fine. But in the other respect is, are we asking the question, what will be the effect of those investments on the environment and social? And often that is ignored. And that's why I flag the business as usual approach. Do we really want just business as usual? My view is, if we can develop processes to finance investment, at the same time we need then new ethics and new business models to drive the industry, and only those particular types of models should be deserving of being financed. Then there's a leakage issue, offshoring. This is relevant to dependency, but typically a high proportion of revenues from tourism leak out of local regions. Tourist expenditure often has a high import content. There's often a narrow production base in many destinations. Coastal regions often fail to capture the economic benefits of cruise tourism, for example. Studies I've done show that the cruise tourism industry doesn't particularly help destinations, because most of the money goes to the cruise lines, not to the destinations. We need to reduce leakages by strengthening the local supply chains to the hotels and resorts. Now, the problem is that liberalised trade systems around the world have led to these intermediaries becoming more powerful, and offshoring occurs, meaning that they retain a lot of the tourism expenditure, especially that which is prepaid. And that is an important issue for the development of the sector, because it certainly seems to be the case that the destinations themselves are not getting the benefits that they think they're getting from much of the development. And the problem here with the SIDS, the small island developing states, they have all of these issues. Narrow resource base, small populations, small domestic market, often low income, they're commodity dependent, they're remote, poor infrastructure, lack of skills, vulnerable to natural disasters, vulnerable to climate change and so on. These governments need extensive international financing for climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. And we need to develop inter-sector linkages between tourism and other sectors to make their economies as resilient as possible. A lot of work needs to be done. And Raoul tells me that you people now within the university are very interested in developing expertise in coastal marine tourism and so on. This is one area that I think is absolutely essential, that you look at the types of characteristics of small island developing states and the constraints that are faced, the challenges, and what types of policies can be formulated in order to overcome these sorts of challenges. And the final section I want to talk about was some opportunities. Effective government requires a coherent policy framework. Now, that's easy to say. Coherent policy framework to guide and drive action and appropriate bodies to ensure policies are implemented. You know, yada yada yada. That's fine. But putting that into operation or implementing it is another matter entirely. And so again, I see a very big challenge involved in actually defining the types of policy frameworks that need to be developed, the governance procedures, the governance processes that need to be developed in this area. There's opportunities, I think, of developing within this broad context of eco-based management. And eco-based management, there's a big literature on that, and it's quite an interesting area, and basically it's an attempt to manage according to the triple bottom line of the economic, but the social, also the social and the environmental. And the recognition of the importance of maintaining the value of ecosystems in any types of development that occur. And I see that as an area. Issues, there needs to be government leadership. We need to go beyond just a traditional terrestrial focus, integrated long-term planning, opportunities to increase community livelihoods and strengthen application of environmental impact assessment. I'll talk about each of these in turn now to finish the talk. These are issues that I think are important in respect of governance. So let's have a look at each one in turn. The first one, government leadership. Again, need for this coherent, integrated, effective public support policy. This would mean, for example, the destination management organisations that are concerned with tourism would be talking with those that are concerned with other industries and so on. There'd be a lot more discussion and policy formulation and governance coming from interaction between different industries. And this requires government support, and this will help to reduce the risk for investors and will be a catalyst for finance if there is serious government support for a coherent, integrated strategy. Governments must demonstrate leadership and embracing recently formulated sustainable development goals. These sustainable development goals are developed by the United Nations, and have I got there? Oh, the government must demonstrate leadership in respect of these areas here. I won't go into them now. But there's opportunities for the tourism industry to assert its relevance as a key industry. And I think what's happened is that in many cases tourism is not taken as a serious industry, and the other industries are not talking with tourism in terms of coordinating plans for development. And I know that it was just an afterthought in the OECD report to address tourism. They were focusing on oil and gas and energy issues with wave motions and so on. And then somebody or other, before I came along, said, oh, you know, they think that adding tourism is a good idea as well, and that was then added. And often it's forgotten. But if there is this attempt to develop coherent, integrated strategies, then tourism will be play an important role in that. We need to go beyond just single governments in making decisions because of the nature of the oceans and so on. We are all on the same planet and all have an interest in the oceans maintaining their vibrancy and so on. And single governments have this limited power to protect the environment because the ecosystems don't know political boundaries. So you need to be sensible about this and go beyond the political boundaries of different country jurisdictions to be much more effective in governance, and it should be much more ecosystem based. Integrated long-term planning, I've mentioned this, so there's a bit of repetition here. Helps to remove barriers, create the necessary enabling environment for catalysing public and private sector. I mentioned this, so I'm sorry, I've repeated this basically. But the point is that if there is good governance, then that can then facilitate the flows of investment funds into developing tourism, coastal marine tourism, within a context of an integrated effort with multi-governments and so on. Opportunities to create increased community livelihoods. This is important. I've flagged it before. It's very important that local communities gain from tourism development. And what we need is strengthening supply and demand conditions, facilitating local jobs, building and maintaining local supply chains. See, in tourism often, the supply chains go out quickly internationally rather than locally. As an economist, it doesn't matter who owns facilities. It doesn't matter if the owner of a hotel is Japanese or Spanish or Australian. It doesn't matter. What matters is where goods and services are sourced to meet tourist needs. If they're sourced from within the destination, they have economic benefits in the destination. They create jobs, they create income. If they're not sourced within the destination, that is if they're imported, then money leaks out, regardless of who owns it. And so what we need is a strengthening of these local supply chains in destinations so that goods and services can be sourced locally within the destination, maximising the benefits. Managing informal local trading, fostering community-based initiatives. And we need to understand the political economy in which tourism develops. There's not enough, I think, attention to the role of intermediaries and so on, and the political economic context in which tourism industries develop, because this can determine just to what extent countries or destinations will benefit from tourism or not. And of course, any tourism development should be sensitive to the needs and aspirations of the local community. It may be that local communities don't want tourism. If they don't want it, that's their business. But often tourism is forced on them. So we need tourism development that's sensitive to the needs and aspirations of local communities. And we need to identify these mechanisms so that local communities can gain. This would be, I would see this as very important for the development of tourism in the Canary Islands, with the different islands and so on, different communities. Tourism always has gainers and losers and so on. These need to be identified and mechanisms put into place for improving community livelihoods. And finally, the strengthening the application of environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment, by the way, extends beyond just the environment. It's now regarded as obviously as including social aspects as well. But there's a view that we need to clarify the types of environmental impact assessments that underpin, or there are rationale for much development. And these environmental impact assessments must take into account community consultation and involvement and so on. And this is especially the case with new destinations and new types of tourism, because we need for environmental impact assessment to underpin the types of developments that are taking place. And as I mentioned, the polar regions with their fragile environments and so on, it's absolutely essential if you're going to develop cruise tourism and so on in polar regions, or tourism generally in coral atolls and archipelagos. We need comprehensive environmental impact assessment of any proposed developments. Now finally, I return to the issue that I dealt with before. I think we need a new sustainability mindset. If we're serious about developing coastal marine tourism in a sustainable way, then all stakeholders must play a role in developing a communal mindset. Conscious leadership is required to steer development of new forms of coastal marine tourism, away from this business as usual, growth-oriented, exploitative mindset. And as I say, I've got a draft of an article which is basically arguing for a new paradigm of tourism development, where I set up the established way of thinking and contrast it with a new way of thinking. I think we need analysis as to what business models are most likely to foster the sustainable development of coastal marine tourism. So, for example, those business models would include a wider view of the purposes of a firm, not just about making profits, but also giving to society. A wider view of the ethical basis for decision making by firms. A wider view of the role that initiatives such as corporate social responsibility and so on can play in the firm's activities. And conclusion, coastal marine tourism is likely to increase at a rate of growth above the average for all tourism. I gave the reasons why tourism is increasing, but over and above that, we looked at some other reasons for thinking that coastal marine tourism is going to be particularly healthy growth rate. At the end of the day, we came to the view that new forms of tourism are likely to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. You guys might have a better idea than me, but we brainstormed about new types of coastal marine tourism And basically they all came out to be variants of what we already had. We couldn't think, maybe it's just our limited brain power, but we couldn't think of revolutionary new types of marine tourism. They all were variants of what we already have, whether it be submarines or diving for shipwrecks or, you know, going and looking at heritage of lighthouses and so on. Anyway, the view was that with tourism, there will be sort of a steady as she goes evolution of new types of tourism, and there will be some new destinations, but by and large they will be the ones we already know about, but there will be more tourism to them, such as the polar regions and remote islands. The new destinations, particularly the polar regions, are associated with high risks. Substantial challenges must be overcome if coastal marine tourism is to develop, and I mentioned about 14 of those challenges. We need collaboration between tourism and other industries. We see that as absolutely crucial to development strategies, and we see good governance as absolutely crucial to seize the opportunities for development. So, thank you very much. I apologise if that was a bit boring. There were no sort of pretty pictures and so on. But I just wanted to convey the essence of the report. And I think it would be up to you as a group of researchers, if any of you are going to pursue any of the issues in coastal marine tourism, you'll be focusing on particular issues. So I didn't give any particular issue the attention that it warrants, because what I tried to do was give you the broad overview. But each of those issues that I've highlighted, you could do a PhD thesis in its own right, you know.
Larry, I would like to thank you for the presentation, even though you say it's a lot of text in it. It's been really helpful to order many things that need to be put together, you know, like definitions that are not, and what are the key issues around development. I have two questions, but first I would like to make to give you a simple thought about the presentation. It seems to me that we could all change the order of what you have presented, because if you consider that business as usual, I mean, let's start with business as usual. What has been happening during the last 20 or 30 years in tourism development? Not only in tourism, because most of urban development happens along the coast. If you look at Tenerife, for example, at night, you see that there's a whole line illuminated, so we have a whole city all around the island. So there's tourism and residential development around the coast. It's a high-value land, especially in places like this, where the weather is nice in the coast and where you have mountains, no? So marine and coastal development and tourism has been happening for decades. We have focused on protected inland areas like the Teide and the mountains and the vegetation, and the biologists, were specialized in land ecosystems. But the water, it seems to us that if we didn't look at it, it was not developed. If we didn't talk about it, we would not see the waste coming into the water, or the fishermen fishing all the fishes. They ended up with our resources many years ago. I mean, the fishes are gone. They were developing the fish industry for tourism. So the business as usual would say that tourism and human development around the coast have been depleting and undervaluing marine and coastal resources.
That would be my view.
Yeah, we did. And at some point we could say afterwards that that's unsustainable. That's social and environmental unsustainable, but also economically unsustainable. Once the fish is gone, once the whales are gone because they don't stand you looking at them, well, and blah blah blah. No, the ocean, we are depleting the ocean without giving it any economic value. So we give a turn to the issue and we say, okay, business as usual is not sustainable. So we need to reinforce the social and environmental value, and that will increase the economic value to all development. It seems to me that this would be a little bit more not only honest, but also useful to look at how economic development and business should develop the whole strategy, you know? Yep. That we don't want new business to develop new things and they have to protect the environment. We need the local agents now in the coastal ecosystem to look at the resources in a different way if they want to keep living on it and to give
I think that's good, and you've articulated that very well. The problem, of course, as you well know, is the free rider problem. I mean, we all know that it's good for us all to have clean environment, but at individual operator level, they simply are looking at making short-term profits and so on. And so what's good for us all, we're aware of, but individual operators can always act as cowboys or rogues. And the problem is, I think the huge problem with all this is to actually bring everyone on board, you know, that they would act in the ways that we would like them to act. That's the difficult thing. But no, I think what you've said, you've articulated very well.
Great. Thank you. And one question I had myself to.
I'll just go to this person and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Maria Jose Barragan. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here in the Political and Science Institute in La Laguna, and I've been working with marine protected areas and fisheries in the last years.
Right.
I thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed.
Oh, thank you.
I would like to know first, and I suppose from the title of your presentation that it's emerging ocean industries toward more or less the achievement of the sustainability development goals. And if that's the situation that I'm assuming, I would like to know what's the target of this report? Who is this report written for?
I think it's governments.
Governments. Okay.
Yeah, I think the OECD has the objective of making these reports available to governments. I had a responsibility for writing up mine. It was based on a preliminary report that I did, then a workshop where they invited people from different parts of the world, and then I wrote it up after that. And I haven't seen it since. What I think the OECD is going to do is somehow or other merge them, so there will be an oil and gas report, a tourism report, and so on within, and it will be targeted to governments.
Okay, and especially because of that, I assume, and I would like to say that what I kind of lack, and something that I see is missing, or perhaps it is, but a little hidden, is the explicit recognition of the articulation of tourism as itself with local communities. I mean, to reset the minding of tourism industry, the ethics behind tourism industry, towards the people who is benefited or not with the development of this industry in the coastal areas. And in order to focus on that, for example, some issues that I really miss, perhaps they are, as you said in the last part of your presentation, they are considered, are, for example, identity of communities involved with tourism, loss of identity, loss of social bonds, of social aspects related to the tourism industry, marginalization, displacement of people in the coastal areas that perhaps have had fisheries interest in the time before and has shifted their activities to tourism in the present. So to perhaps reset or rephrase the ethics of tourism development in the future.
Oh, look, what you've said is perfectly fine. I mean, there are lots and lots of issues that are quite essential in this area. We only were able to deal. We had a frame of reference, and it was in fact the emerging industries that were relevant to the oceans and coastal marine tourism. We did attempt to talk about issues of community livelihoods and the importance of this to communities, but I can't pretend that what we said was every last detail of the issues. The issues you've addressed, marginalism and so on, are very important. The report alludes to it, but we couldn't do everything within the one report. But I think those issues we did, well, at least we flagged in our section on community livelihoods and so on. But yeah, I mean, there's so many important issues there, especially for remote island communities.
You have always talked about, I mean, that astonished me, that you talk about social and environmental impacts all together, all the time, which highlights also the social impacts of tourism development. I think it's very original for me to see that.
Well, the other reports that I saw on oil and gas and something about wave motions and so on had environmental issues discussed, but nothing about social issues. The interesting thing about tourism, the tourism report, was that we did recognise the importance of social effects of tourism development. So when this report goes alongside the others, readers will see that there are important social aspects to tourism development that they may not have been aware of. And I think that's going to be an important thing that emerges.
Do you think, Larry, in this sense, I think it was a fantastic overview of the problem, and I guess that tourism can be tourism as a field of knowledge, of applied knowledge, can make an important contribution in this blue economy. If you look at the journals, there are a lot of journals on marine issues, ocean. There are plenty of good journals, but without a complete. I mean, they are dominated by biologists, marine biologists, and this kind of approach that is important. But here, for example, a question of governance emerged and are in the center of the new paradigm or new situation. And I wonder if, maybe for one of the first time, tourism can contribute to the solution of a problem that is related to tourism, but is broader than the question of tourism. Tourism studies have been sometimes marginalized from all the body of knowledge in other, and I think that this can be a good opportunity to put the question that we are every day dealing with in tourism, putting them and giving them to the whole scientific political community and say, okay, we have been working on governance for years and dealing with this kind of problem. Yeah. And the problem of sustainability, not in a theoretical way, but in a very practical, we are dealing, and the problem of data in small location is related with tourism, and tourism can make a contribution.
I hope so. Yeah, I certainly hope so, and it'll be quite different to many of the other reports. I mean, the other reports, as I say, on oil and gas side, don't talk about impacts on communities and things like that.
We have a project also on you know, there were prospections for oil in the Canary Islands last year. There was an important debate on tourism versus oil extraction. We have all that question, but if you focus in oil research, it's very limited to technical issues, but not social issues are not in the center of the debate at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have a more methodological question, because in one of your last slides you were talking about the environmental impact assessment. So I was wondering which model, for example, because I have read about some this driver pressure response impact state or the pressure state response. Should those models would be valid for the study of the impact of maritime and coastal tourism?
Well, yes. I mean, I've seen those models. I mean, as you say, there are a number of different frameworks, but I think they're essential to be used. I mean, I can't say which framework is best, and it might be horses for courses. You know, might determine the context, might determine. But it seems to me that if we're serious about saying that tourism should progress sustainably, we've got to then have assessment techniques that take into account the social, environmental as well as economic effects. So economic impact assessment, I think with its broader horizon is absolutely essential. But I wasn't saying which particular model should be used. That's for the experts to determine. Am I answering your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just was wondering if they are like valid or new models should be developed or just.
Well,
we can have those.
I guess that area is developing all the time. You know, I mean, indicator assessment and so on, and monitoring, and I think that area is progressing. And what one does at the time is develop the best current models and applying them for economic environmental impact assessment.
Larry, could you say an example of good governance an example of a destination of good governance in marine tourism?
Oh, no. I think no. I mean, there are different countries in the world that do have certain marine parks and so on. The United States has